Good afternoon, Maria. Thank you for meeting with us today.
Delighted, Jamie.
So, you've just returned from the Synod with the bishops on the families. Can you tell us what are some of your observations as an observer at the Synod?
One of them is the recognition that Pope Francis has had for all the time that he's been writing, and certainly since he's been Pope, of the central place that families have in the life of the Church. And the central place they have as the image of the Holy Family. And that was a very powerful message throughout. So that was number one, is that families in all of their forms are central, and nobody is going to disagree with that, whether they're in the Catholic faith or otherwise. But there was a particular form of family which really is about, hopefully two parents and a number of children, and nurtured in their trials, as well as being people who themselves were subjects of working with other families. So families are not just as objects, and they keep talking about family as subject and family as object. Family as object, what we need to care for and nurture and look after, and family as subject, the family going out to and reaching out to other families and forming communities, not just around their parish community, but supporting each other. So that was rather a lovely concept.
Mm-hmm.
The second one that I deeply appreciated, and I think most of us did, I probably appreciated it more than some of the bishops, to be frank, was the terrible trials that are accompanying so many families. Because I've worked for so long with families in trouble and chair Catholic Social Services, which provides services for individuals and families in trouble. The messiness and troubles and trials of families is uppermost in my mind. So there is the image of the ideal family. I call it the ideal. It's realisable, but it's ideal. And then there's the memory and the knowledge I have around the terrible trials that families have. And that second one was brought to light very strongly by the various people from, for example, the Middle East,
Mm-hmm.
the bishops from the Middle East,
Mm-hmm.
the bishops from Asia,
Mm-hmm.
particularly Syria,
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about, our bishops talked about the refugee issues here. These are all families.
Mm-hmm.
These are all people who are struggling to even be together, to have a home, let alone to realise what family life is actually about.
Mm.
And some of that, interestingly enough, from Eastern Europe was about the men folk and the women needing to leave their family and go to find work to bring money back. So there was huge emphasis around the significance of families and the trials of families, those two. The third issue for me really was the openness of the Church. And it, in some senses, it should be the dominant issue for me, but because we're talking about families, I think we put families first. That third one is around the Catholic Church opening the shutters a bit more again after Vatican II. And there was a really significant, there's a significant reference, a hugely significant reference to Vatican II and the opening up of the Church, not changing church doctrine. There was a big resistance to, a big worry amongst some bishops about the thought that there might be a challenge to church doctrine. But there was a general openness to how do we engage better as a church? How do we become more transparent? How do we appear less bureaucratic?
Mm-hmm.
How do we engage young people?
Mm-hmm.
How do we use the media to benefit? How do we do what Pope Francis wants us to do, and be a church with open arms, rather than a church which punishes? So that was fantastic.
Mm.
And associated with that was the fourth issue, and I think I've already mentioned it, but it was another issue, and that was, and I think a lot of the journalists talked about this or even tried to open it up more, was the tension between the people, the cardinals, the bishops, the clergy that wanted to hold on tight and who were really quite frightened and worried about what it would mean if there was too much change. And the others, epitomised, I think, by the Germans and people from various nations, but certainly the Germans were in the lead, really saying the walls aren't going to fall down if, this church is strong. Let some more air in. So that tension was written about, and I have to say was quite evident.
Mm.
The two matters that I think dominated the thinking in the Synod in a public way were the issues of the Eucharist for divorced and remarried, and the other one was the difficult issue of homosexuality and recognising same-sex attracted people. And those were tensions that were very apparent, and in some ways I think resolved in a way that provided opportunities for ongoing thought and reflection. And I think they will be what Pope Francis is interested in exploring more about how we deal with that. The final one, and probably as controversial as any, that came up a little bit during the Synod and was really brought up by a couple of the women religious and one extraordinary sociologist. And I say extraordinary because she was so outspoken, and it was about the role of women in the church. And again, as I'd said to you earlier, we need to just be open about the fact that that's a big question. And it's interesting enough, it's a question for our Aboriginal colleagues, and that's one of the issues I raised at the Synod in my short intervention, is that in this case, and I can't speak for Aboriginal people, but I can, having spoken with them, I'm very aware of the issue of women in the church for them. But it was brought up from other cultures too, African cultures in particular, that there was an expectation within cultures that women have a place. And clearly our church is interested in exploring that.
What are your hopes for the outcomes from the Synod in terms of them, say, being implemented in the future?
Well, the outcomes from the Synod are threefold, I guess. The one is that there's going to be a document, and probably what I didn't talk about enough was the processes of the Synod, which were quite extraordinary in their openness and their orderliness, and their the Pope had issued an invitation to engage with difference, to welcome different points of view, to let the air in, to not be distressed by difference, but to see where the Spirit took us. And by and large, that's what happened. People were able to say what they wanted to say. And the small group discussions were, by and large, not all of them, but I think most of them, from what I heard, very open to input from lay people and from the various cardinals and bishops and fraternal brothers and sisters, particularly fraternal, so they were the other Christian churches that were present, and the Orthodox. The processes were fantastic, I think. And apart from the voting system folding at one time because the electronic system went wrong, it just went like clockwork. So the processes were excellent, and the end product was a document that I understand Pope Francis has said will be produced in the way that it was finally read out on the closing day of the Synod. So that's great.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, and there's different views about this document, by the way. Now, be clear, I haven't read it. It was read out loud. The lay people were not given a copy.
Mm-hmm.
It was in Italian anyway, so it wouldn't have been very helpful for me. But we heard what was said. So I can make my judgment on two things. One, what I heard, and one, what the bishops and cardinals and the various people who had read it said to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that not only has the document got some openings for further discussion, but that Pope Francis has engaged in a process, or we've all engaged in a process with him, which opens up possibilities for him to have more dialogue about some of the issues. Now, one of the ones, there are always ones I haven't mentioned, one of the ones that preceded the Synod, one of the discussions that preceded the Synod was the centralism versus, what I call centralism versus regionalism. How much does the Vatican hold on to, and how much does it regionalise? How much authority does it give to the various dioceses, well, archdioceses in this instance, to discern around doctrine, not changing doctrine? And how much does the Vatican hold on? Now, it should be pretty clear to all of us, if we've read what Pope Francis says, that he's really interested in letting go a bit. That, and I think that we will see, as a result of, my hope, we will see as a result of this, less centralised control, while holding on to the doctrinal base, but just trusting the cardinals and bishops to discern in relation to the particulars of cultures. That would be very exciting. So I think the two things I'm hopeful for is that there's an opening up, and there's a chance that there will be more opportunity for local thinking.
Sure.
And that includes culture. I mean, it includes things like how do we best engage with our different cultures? How do we engage best with thinking about family in the Catholic tradition that actually understands that kinship systems which Aboriginal people use worldwide are diametrically opposed to our nuclear family system. You know, as I said in my intervention, in most of the kinship groups, Aboriginal children have many mothers because they have mum and they have mum sisters. And interestingly, some of the African bishops talked about that too. So I know our church tries to adapt to that because, acculturation is part of the history of our church. So I think that's exciting. I think it's also, I'm very hopeful that we will have much more engagement around what is the role of women. There are female theologians, many of them, female experts, and there were some female experts at the Synod. And I don't know how that's going to work through, because again, the doctrine of women as priests is not going to be, of not being priests, not having women priests is absolute. But that's not the only way that women can be present and serve in the church. So I think that creativity's, I think it's emerged already with what Pope Francis has been doing and saying. But there's some resistance, huge resistance. And I have to say that Vatican is a male hierarchy of the First Order. A very colourful one. But it is it's a male bureaucracy. So it'll be interesting to see how the Vatican changes. And again, Pope Francis has started that process. He's reviewing the Curia. You know, he's got a new committee reviewing the Curia. He has, I mean, this is not to do with the Synod. Preceding the Synod, he'd set these up. He, on the penultimate day, I think it was the penultimate day, he announced the new commission, which is an amalgamation of 3 commissions: the laity, the family, and I can't remember, the one was 2 commissions and one other. I don't actually know what that means, and none of us have seen more. He just announced it, and we haven't actually seen what that looks like. So, in my language, the terms of reference are being drawn up, but there's another language in the Vatican that they use. Those are things. And I think the other one is, I do think there was a real recognition of youth, and the. Again, we know that Pope Francis and Pope Benedict were before him, and John Paul. I mean, they've all been interested in how we engage better with youth. But Pope Francis is clearly really keen to do that. So I had a great sense of some fresh air.
Maria, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.